Garden Lodge, Kensington, a piano tuner, arrived for what should have been a routine appointment. The kind of visit he had made to this house several times before across the years. Always the same instrument, always the same specific attention Freddie Mercury brought to every detail of its maintenance, except, as the tuner had noticed on every previous visit without ever mentioning it. One particular key, D sharp in the middle register, produced a sound that no properly maintained piano should produce. A faint crack beneath the note, barely perceptible unless you were listening for it the way a trained tuner listens for it, but unmistakable once heard. He had assumed, on his first visit years earlier, that Freddie simply hadn't noticed, that a touring musician's ear, however extraordinary in performance, might overlook a technical flaw in an instrument used primarily for private composition rather than public display. By 1988, after several visits, he understood this assumption had been wrong. He raised it directly this time, professional courtesy finally giving way to professional curiosity, and said, "Mr. Mercury, this key, the D sharp, it's not sitting correctly. It's an easy repair. I could have it sounding perfect within the hour." Freddie's response came immediately, without the pause that might have suggested he was considering the offer, and the sharpness of his refusal surprised the tuner enough that he remembered the exact words for years afterward. "No, it stays exactly as it is." The tuner, confused by the specific force behind such an ordinary piece of maintenance advice, asked whether there was a reason, expecting perhaps some minor technical explanation, a note he was fond of despite its imperfection. And Freddie's only response was to change the subject entirely, moving the conversation toward the rest of the instrument's needs with the specific efficiency of someone. Closing a door he had no intention of reopening. The tuner completed his work, adjusted everything else on the piano to Freddie's exacting standards, and left that afternoon with a question he would carry, unanswered, for years. The instrument itself had a history that predated Garden Lodge, had traveled with Freddie across several homes before settling permanently in the room where he composed most of his later material, and among the small circle of people who spent significant time in that house, the piano was understood to hold a specific significance beyond its function as furniture or tool. It was where Freddie worked through ideas alone, late at night, in the specific privacy that even his closest friends rarely interrupted, and the D-sharp key's imperfection, though never directly discussed by anyone in the household, had become one of those unremarked-upon facts of domestic life that everyone simply absorbed without questioning. The way a house eventually accommodates its own idiosyncrasies until no one remembers to ask why the third stair creaks, or why one particular window never opens completely. What almost no one in that household understood, what remained entirely private to Freddie himself until the very final months of his life, was the specific history that key carried. A history that reached back 13 years before that piano tuner's visit to a night in 1975 at Rockfield Studios in Wales during the marathon recording sessions that would eventually produce Bohemian Rhapsody. Freddie had been working alone in the studio's smaller practice room during a break from the main session, running through variations on the song's closing passage, searching for the specific quality of finality the piece needed after its extraordinary structural journey through ballad and opera and hard rock. And at some point during that late-night search, his finger had struck a D-sharp on an aging upright piano that the studio kept in that smaller room, an instrument considerably less pristine than the main recording piano. And the note that emerged carried a faint, unmistakable crack beneath its pitch, the specific sound of an imperfect mechanism producing something technically flawed and, in that exact moment, exactly right. Freddie played it again and again, testing whether the crack was consistent, whether it was something the instrument would reliably produce, or simply a single accident of timing and pressure that could never be recreated. It proved consistent. The specific mechanical flaw in that particular key produced that particular sound every time, and Freddie, Alone in that practice room, at whatever hour of the early morning it had reached by that point in the session, found himself unable to stop returning to it, playing the phrase surrounding that flawed note over and over, understanding something about it that he would not fully articulate to another person for 16 years. The crack in the sound did something the pure, correct version of the note could not do. It carried, embedded directly in its acoustic signature, the specific quality of imperfection meeting intention, of a flawed instrument producing something that felt, despite its technical incorrectness, more honest than perfection could have managed. Freddie did not use that exact broken piano on the final recording. The actual studio session for Bohemian Rhapsody employed the meticulous overdubbing and layering that the song has become famous for, using the primary recording piano rather than the flawed upright in the practice room. But something about that late-night discovery stayed with him in a way that outlasted the specific instrument that had produced it. A private understanding about the relationship between technical perfection and emotional truth that he apparently never discussed with Brian, Roger, or John during the song's creation, and that he carried, privately, for the rest of his life as a kind of internal touchstone whenever the question of his own flaws, his own imperfections, his own carefully hidden vulnerabilities threatened to feel like something shameful, rather than something that might, properly understood, carry its own specific value. This history remained entirely unknown to the piano tuner in 1988, unknown to Mary Austin, unknown to Jim Hutton, unknown to anyone in Freddie's household across the following years, because Freddie simply never explained it, choosing instead to let the flawed D-sharp exist in his home as an unremarked upon fact, a quiet private monument to a night in 1975 that only he fully understood the significance of. The piano tuner returned periodically across the following years, and on each visit, out of what had become a kind of ritual professional acknowledgement, he would mention the key's condition, offer again to fix it, and receive again the same brief, absolute refusal, until eventually he stopped mentioning it entirely, understanding without ever being told directly that this was simply how the instrument was meant to remain. Years passed this way, the piano's single flawed key becoming, in its own small way, as permanent a fixture of Garden Lodge as the Japanese art collection, or the cats that moved freely through the house's rooms, present and unquestioned and entirely characteristic of the specific man who lived there, and who had decided, for reasons he shared with no one, that this particular imperfection deserved permanent preservation rather than correction. It was only in the final months of 1991, as Freddie's illness had progressed to the point where his physical world had narrowed dramatically, that the question finally surfaced directly, asked not by the piano tuner, but by Mary Austin, who had spent enough years in that house to have absorbed the same unspoken understanding everyone else had absorbed, that the piano's flaw was simply permanent, until something about the specific atmosphere of those final months, the sense that unanswered questions were accumulating a particular urgency, prompted her to finally ask what she had wondered about for years without ever quite finding the moment to voice it. She found him at the piano on an afternoon when his strength allowed him to sit upright for longer than usual, and she asked, with the specific gentleness she had learned to bring to questions in that house during those final months, why he had never had that key fixed, all these years, when the repair would have been so simple. Freddie did not answer immediately. He looked at the instrument for a long moment, his thin hands resting on the keys without pressing them, and then, with the specific deliberateness that had characterized so much of his behavior in those final weeks, he pressed the D-sharp himself, producing the same faint crack beneath the note that had first emerged from an entirely humbler piano 16 years earlier in a small practice room in Wales. This sound, he said, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone finally sharing something held privately for a very long time, came to me one night in 1975. I composed the final note of Bohemian Rhapsody's ending on a key exactly like this one, with exactly this crack in it. Mary, by her own later account, had not known this detail, had never heard any version of this story in all her years of friendship with Freddie, and she asked carefully whether he meant the actual recording, whether this specific flaw had somehow made it onto the finished song the world had been listening to for 16 years. Freddie shook his head slightly. No, the recording is perfect, note for note, layered exactly as we intended. But that's not what I remember when I hear this crack. I remember finding something true in something broken. And I've never wanted to forget that, no matter how much money or fame came after, no matter how perfect the world thinks I am. He continued, and Mary would later describe this specific portion of the conversation as the most unguarded she had ever heard him. More unguarded even than some of the conversations they had shared decades earlier when their relationship had been at its most intimate. "This is my imperfect perfection," Freddie said, and Mary has confirmed this exact phrase across every account she has given of the conversation. The specific construction of it apparently significant enough to him that he had clearly considered the wording before speaking it aloud, perhaps even privately across years of turning the thought over, without ever voicing it. The world sees the finished thing, the polished thing, the thing that sounds like it could never have been anything other than exactly what it became. But I hear this crack, and I remember that I'm human too, that I'm flawed, the way everyone is flawed, and that this is beautiful, not something to hide or fix or apologize for. Mary asked whether he had ever told anyone else this story, whether Brian or Roger or John knew the specific significance this single piano key carried, and Freddie's answer, delivered with the particular finality that had become characteristic of so many of his statements in those final months, was direct and complete. "No, and I'd like it to stay that way for now. Perhaps you'll tell people, someday, if it ever feels like the right thing to do, but not while I'm here to hear how they'd react to it." Mary honored this instruction with the same consistency she has brought to every other private request Freddie made of her during those final months, declining to discuss the piano key's specific history publicly during the years immediately following his death. Choosing instead to let the instrument remain exactly as Freddie had left it, D-sharp still carrying its faint crack, still occupying its specific room at Garden Lodge, unrepaired, and by every account that has surfaced since, unrepaired to this day. The specific question of whether the flawed key genuinely traces back to that 1975 night at Rockfield Studios. Whether Freddie's private account to Mary represents accurate memory or the kind of meaningful narrative a person constructs late in life to make sense of an idiosyncratic personal attachment has never been independently verified by anyone who was present at those original recording sessions. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and the studio engineers who worked on Bohemian Rhapsody across its extended 1975 recording process have never publicly confirmed or denied the existence of an upright piano in a smaller practice room, have never publicly discussed any late-night session involving Freddie alone experimenting with flawed instrumentation, and the specific detail of the crack itself. The precise mechanical origin of the sound Freddie described to Mary in 1991 remains something that exists only in the account Mary Austin has shared, carefully and rarely, across the years since. What can be confirmed, through the piano tuner's own recollection corroborated informally by household staff who observed the same pattern of refusal across multiple years, is that the specific key in question was genuinely, verifiably left unrepaired throughout Freddie's ownership of that instrument, that multiple professional offers to fix a simple and inexpensive mechanical flaw were consistently declined across at least 3 years of documented interaction, and that Freddie's explanation, whenever pressed even slightly on the subject, remained essentially consistent in its refusal to elaborate, right up until the specific afternoon in 1991 when he apparently decided, for reasons that belong entirely to the particular clarity that sometimes accompanies a person's final months, that Mary alone deserved to understand the full weight of what that single flawed note had come to mean to him. The piano remains, according to the limited information that has become available across the decades since Freddie's death, in private possession, its exact current location undisclosed, its condition unknown to anyone outside the small circle who might have had contact with it since 1991. Whether the D-sharp key continues to carry its distinctive crack, whether it has been repaired at some point by someone unaware of its significance, whether it has been preserved deliberately as a specific act of honoring what Freddie told Mary that afternoon, remains entirely unconfirmed. One more detail in a life that generated, across its final years especially, an accumulation of small private mysteries that the people closest to Freddie Mercury have chosen, almost uniformly, to protect rather than resolve. What the story offers, regardless of its precise factual verification, is a specific window into something Freddie Mercury apparently understood about himself long before the world understood anything similar about him. A private philosophy of imperfection maintained for 16 years inside an object most people would have simply repaired without a second thought. Evidence of a man who had built an entire public identity around the pursuit of vocal and performative perfection, while privately, quietly, insisting that one small broken thing remain broken. Because somewhere inside that specific flaw lived a truth about being human that polish and perfection could never fully capture, and that he apparently needed for 16 years to keep exactly as it was, unfixed, uncorrected, and entirely his own.